do you take this woman in accordance with the wishes of the deceased and the terms of this agreement?
Alexander Thorne, the Duke of Ashworth, had never imagined his wedding day would feel like attending a funeral. If you're watching this tale of unexpected passion unfold, I invite you to share with us in the comments where in the world you're joining from, whether you're listening from London, New York, or somewhere in between. And if you believe in love that defies all expectations, please like this story, share it with fellow romantics, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that will capture your heart. Now, let us return to our Duke, standing at the altar of a small country church, about to bind himself to a woman he had met only once before, at her brother's funeral. The afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor where Alexander stood rigid in his finest black coat. October rain drummed against the roof, a relentless rhythm that matched the hollow beating of his heart. Before him, at the modest altar of St. Margaret's Church in the village of Hartfield, stood Eleanor Ashby, soon to be Eleanor Thorne, Duchess of Ashworth, though the title seemed an ill-fitting garment for the woman before him. She wore gray, not the white of a hopeful bride, nor even the lavender of half-mourning, but the full gray of deep grief. It was proper, he supposed, given that her brother had been dead only 3 months. Captain Thomas Ashby, Alexander's dearest friend since their days at Eton, his companion through war and peace, the man who had taken a bullet meant for Alexander on a blood-soaked field in Portugal, the man whose dying words had been a plea. Promise me, Alex. Promise you'll take care of Eleanor. Marry her. She has no one else. And Alexander, holding his friend's hand as life drained from his eyes, had promised. What else could he do? Thomas had saved his life. The least Alexander could offer in return was this, a marriage of convenience, a home for a woman's society had already dismissed as unmarriageable. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast as the vicar droned through the ceremony. Alexander studied her profile, searching for some resemblance to Thomas, some familiar feature that might make this easier. But where Thomas had been golden-haired and open-faced, his sister was dark and closed off. Her chestnut hair was pulled severely back beneath a simple bonnet. Her face, what he could see of it, was pale and pinched, as though she held herself under the strictest control. She was not beautiful. That was his first assessment, made with the cold practicality of a man who had courted some of London's greatest beauties and found them all wanting. Eleanor Ashby possessed none of the soft prettiness society valued in women. Her features were too strong, a determined jaw, a nose that was a shade too prominent, eyebrows too dark and definite above eyes he could not see. She was also, at 28, firmly on the shelf. A spinster aunt in all but name, living in her brother's modest estate, tending to an aging mother until that lady's death 2 years past. Thomas had spoken of her occasionally, her stubbornness, her peculiar intelligence, her refusal of the few suitors who had shown interest in her youth. Eleanor is particular, Thomas had said once, with a mixture of frustration and affection. She insists on marrying for love, the foolish creature. I fear she'll end up alone. Well, she would not be alone now, but neither would she have love. Do you, Alexander James Thorne, Duke of Ashworth, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice echoed in the nearly empty church. Only a handful of witnesses attended, his solicitor, Eleanor's aging maid, the vicar, and a few curious villagers who had heard that a duke was marrying their Miss Ashby. And do you, Eleanor Margaret Ashby, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? A pause. For a terrible moment, Alexander wondered if she would refuse. It would be within her rights. He knew she had not wanted this marriage any more than he had. When he had come to Hartfield Manor 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral to honor his promise, she had met him in the drawing room with her spine straight and her eyes dry. You need not do this, your grace, she had said, her voice low and steady. I release you from any promise made to my brother. I am quite capable of managing on my own. But he had seen the truth behind the brave words. Hartfield Manor was crumbling, debts mounting, creditors circling. Thomas had been a soldier, not a man of business, and what little fortune the Ashby family once possessed had dwindled to nothing. Eleanor's choices were stark. Marry the Duke and live in comfort, or face genteel poverty, perhaps even the necessity of seeking employment as a governess or companion. "I do not break my promises, Miss Ashby," he had replied. "The banns will be read starting Sunday. We will marry in 4 weeks." "And now, in this cold church with rain weeping against the windows," she whispered. "I do." The vicar pronounced them man and wife. Alexander turned to his bride, lifted the veil from her face, and finally met her eyes directly. They were gray-green, like the sea before a storm, and in their depths he saw what she had hidden from the world. A vast, aching grief that mirrored his own. Something twisted in his chest. Pity, perhaps, or recognition that they were both prisoners of duty and loss. He kissed her. It was brief, perfunctory, the brush of his lips against hers lasting no more than a heartbeat. Her lips were soft but unresponsive, and when he pulled back, her expression remained unchanged, remote, unreachable. "Your Grace," she murmured, the title strange on her tongue. "Eleanor," he replied, because he could not bring himself to call her wife, not yet. The wedding breakfast that followed was a dismal affair held at Hartfield Manor. The dining room was shabby genteel, the furniture worn, the silver tarnished. Alexander's chef had sent food from Ashworth Hall, but it seemed obscene somehow, such luxury in this place of decay. Eleanor picked at her plate, speaking only when spoken to, her responses polite but minimal. She had no family left to celebrate with her, no friends in attendance. This should have been a joyful occasion, the beginning of a new life, but it felt instead like an ending, the closing of a door on the woman she had been, whoever that was. As the afternoon waned, Alexander's coach arrived to take them to Ashworth Hall. Eleanor emerged from the house wearing a dark traveling dress, a small trunk containing her worldly possessions loaded onto the carriage. She paused at the threshold of her childhood home, her hand resting on the doorframe, and for a moment her careful composure cracked. He saw her throat work as she swallowed, saw her fingers tighten against the wood. Then she squared her shoulders, walked to the carriage, and climbed inside without a backward glance. They rode in silence through the darkening countryside. Alexander sat across from her, ostensibly reading correspondence, but in truth watching her covertly. She kept her face turned to the window, though there was nothing to see but her own reflection in the glass and the blur of rain beyond. What was she thinking? Did she resent him for this marriage, even though it had saved her from destitution? Did she grieve for the life she might have had, the love match she had once dreamed of in her youth? He found he wanted to know, which surprised him. He had expected to feel nothing but obligation toward this woman. Yet something about her stillness intrigued him. The sense that beneath her contained exterior lay depths he could not fathom. "We will reach Ashworth Hall within the hour," he said, breaking the silence. She turned from the window. "Thank you, Your Grace. You may call me Alexander. We are married now." "As you wish, Alexander." His name sounded foreign in her voice, too intimate for the strangers they were. "You will have your own apartments, of course," he continued, suddenly feeling the need to fill the silence. "The Duchess's chambers have been prepared for you. If there is anything you require, you need only ask the housekeeper, Mrs. Bolton. She will see to your comfort." "You are very kind." Kind. The word felt like an accusation. He was not being kind. He was being dutiful, honoring a debt, providing for her material needs while offering nothing of himself. Kindness would be caring whether she was happy. Kindness would be trying to know her, but he did not want to know her. This marriage was a burden he bore because honor demanded it, nothing more. He would give her his name, his protection, his wealth. He would treat her with respect and courtesy. But he would not give her his heart that belonged still to grief, to the memory of a friend lost, to the guilt that ate at him in the dark hours of the night. "I hope you will be comfortable at Ashworth Hall," he said stiffly. "I am sure I shall be." Her tone was equally formal, accepting the distance he had created between them. When the carriage finally rolled up the sweeping drive to Ashworth Hall, Eleanor could not quite suppress her sharp intake of breath. The ducal seat was magnificent even in the rain, a Palladian masterpiece of honey-colored stone, with soaring columns and wings that stretched seemingly forever. Lights blazed from dozens of windows, and liveried servants stood ready at the entrance. It was a palace. And she, Eleanor Ashby, who had grown up in a modest manor house with leaking roofs and threadbare carpets, was now its mistress. The absurdity of it would have made her laugh if she had any laughter left in her. Alexander handed her down from a carriage. His hand was warm even through their gloves, his grip steady and impersonal. The servants bowed and curtsied as they entered, their faces curious but carefully blank. Eleanor felt their gazes on her drab gray dress, her unfashionable hair, her unremarkable face, and knew what they thought. How did such a woman catch a duke? The answer, of course, was that she hadn't. She had been a debt to be paid, a promise to be kept, a duty to be discharged. Mrs. Bolton, the housekeeper, appeared, a severe woman of middle years with sharp eyes that assessed Eleanor in a single sweeping glance. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall. Shall I show you to your apartments?" Eleanor glanced at Alexander, but he was already turning away, summoning his secretary with some matter of urgent business. He did not even bid her good night. "Yes, thank you," Eleanor said quietly. She followed Mrs. Bolton up the grand staircase, through corridors hung with priceless paintings and lit by crystal chandeliers. The Duchess's apartments were in the east wing, a suite of rooms decorated in pale blue and gold, luxurious beyond anything Eleanor had ever imagined. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace. Her trunk looked pathetic in the dressing room, dwarfed by the enormous wardrobes and chests. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Mrs. Bolton asked. "Your Grace." The title still felt like a costume she wore, ill-fitting and false. "No, thank you. You may go." When the door closed behind the housekeeper, Eleanor stood in the center of the opulent room and felt the loneliness crash over her like a wave. She was married. She was a duchess. She lived in a palace. And she had never felt more alone in her entire life. She walked to the window and looked out over the darkened grounds, seeing nothing but her own pale reflection in the glass. Somewhere in this vast house was her husband, a stranger who had married her out of obligation, who looked at her with distant courtesy but no warmth, who could barely stand to speak to her. Thomas would have hated this. Her beloved brother, who had been her champion and friend, who had wanted her to marry for love, would have been horrified to know his dying wish had trapped her in this gilded cage. But Thomas was dead, and she was here, bound to a man who did not want her, living a life that did not feel like her own. Eleanor pressed her hand against the cold glass and allowed herself one moment of grief. For Thomas, for herself, for the love she had always hoped to find and now never would. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes, and began to unpack her trunk. Self-pity served no purpose. She had made her choice. Now she would live with it, just as the Duke would live with her. Two strangers bound by vows and duty, nothing more. Neither of them suspected that within days, everything would change. That obligation would transform into something far more dangerous. That the Duke would find himself consumed by thoughts of the woman he had married, haunted by her presence, obsessed in ways he could not understand or control. But that awakening still lay ahead, waiting in the shadows of Ashworth Hall like a secret yet to be revealed. Eleanor woke on her first morning as the Duchess of Ashworth to discover that her husband had already left the house. His Grace departed for London at dawn. Mrs. Bolton informed her coolly when Eleanor finally found her way to the breakfast room after getting lost twice in the labyrinthine corridors. He had business with his solicitors. He did not say when he would return. The message was clear. The Duke had fled. Less than 12 hours after installing his unwanted bride in his home, he had escaped to the city, leaving her to navigate this unfamiliar world alone. Eleanor sat at the enormous mahogany table in the breakfast room, dwarfed by its size, and stared at the array of silver, chafing dishes before her. There was enough food to feed a regiment: coddled eggs, kippers, ham, toast, pastries, fruit. At Hartfield, breakfast had been porridge and yesterday's bread. The abundance felt obscene. A footman stood against the wall, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on some point above her head. He had not smiled when she entered, had not welcomed her, had simply pulled out her chair with mechanical efficiency, as though she were a piece of furniture to be arranged rather than the mistress of the house. "Just tea, please," Eleanor said quietly, "and perhaps some toast." The footman's eyebrow flickered, barely perceptible, but she saw it. Judgment. The new Duchess, so common she doesn't even know how to take a proper breakfast. She ate quickly, uncomfortable under his silent scrutiny, and then fled to the relative safety of her rooms. but she could not hide there forever. This was her home now, whether she felt like an intruder or not. She needed to understand its rhythms, meet its inhabitants, find some place within it that might feel like her own. Mrs. Bolton gave her a tour of the main rooms, with all the warmth of a jailer, showing a prisoner her cell. The blue salon, Your Grace. The Duke's grandmother decorated it. Those are portraits of the family, dating back to the third Duke. The Chinese vases are Ming Dynasty. His Grace acquired them on his grand tour. Please do instruct the maids not to touch them. The implication hung in the air. Eleanor herself should probably not touch them either. Every room was a masterpiece of taste and wealth. Silk wallpapers, Aubusson carpets, furniture by Chippendale and Sheraton, paintings by Reynolds and Gainsborough. Eleanor felt like a child pressed against the windows of a shop, looking at beautiful things she had no right to possess. And this, Mrs. Bolton said, opening a door with obvious reluctance, is the music room. The late Duchess, His Grace's mother, was an accomplished pianist. No one plays now, of course. Eleanor stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the light streaming through tall windows. A magnificent pianoforte stood in the corner, its surface dulled by disuse. Music books lay stacked on a nearby table, and on the walls hung portraits of beautiful, elegant women, duchesses past, all of them looking far more suited to the title than Eleanor could ever hope to be. Does His Grace play? Eleanor asked. No, Your Grace. He has no interest in music. Mrs. Bolton's tone suggested this was yet another way in which Eleanor would prove inadequate. What use was a duchess who might play if the Duke did not care to hear it? They continued through the house. The servants they encountered offered curtsies and bows, but no warmth. Eleanor caught whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, saw exchanged glances, heavy with meaning. She was an outsider, accepted only because she wore the Duke's ring, resented for reasons she could only guess at. Perhaps they had expected him to marry differently. Some glittering society beauty who would host legendary balls and fill the house with important guests. Instead, he had brought home a spinster nobody from the countryside. And for what? Charity? Pity? They did not understand, and neither did Eleanor herself. By afternoon, desperate for some respite from Mrs. Bolton's cold efficiency, Eleanor asked if she might explore the gardens. As you wish, Your Grace. Though I should warn you, they are not what they once were. The Duke dismissed the head gardener 2 years ago, and has not replaced him. He says he has no time for such frivolities. The gardens Eleanor discovered were heartbreaking. Clearly, they had once been magnificent, geometric parterres, rose gardens, a wilderness walk, even a small lake with a Grecian folly. But now they were sliding into gentle ruin. Weeds choked the flower beds, hedges grew wild and untrimmed, the folly's paint peeled in long strips. Yet even in decay, there was beauty. Roses bloomed defiantly among the weeds, their fragrance heavy on the autumn air. An ancient wisteria had claimed an entire wall, its twisted branches creating a natural sculpture. And the wilderness walk, overgrown as it was, possessed a romantic wildness that took Eleanor's breath away. She spent 2 hours walking those abandoned paths, and for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Hall, she felt something like peace. Here, no servants watched her with judgment. Here, no priceless objects reminded her of her inadequacy. Here, she could simply be Eleanor, not the Duchess, not the unwanted wife, just a woman who loved growing things. That evening, she dined alone in the vast formal dining room, seated at one end of a table that could accommodate 40. 20 feet away, Alexander's empty chair mocked her. Course after course appeared, soup, fish, removes, dessert, each more elaborate than the last, and all of it tasting like ash in her mouth. Is this to be my life? She thought, staring down the length of that empty table. Luxury and loneliness, wealth and isolation? The second day passed much like the first and the third. No word came from Alexander. Eleanor explored more of the house, finding a conservatory with neglected orchids, a gallery of family portraits where she studied her husband's painted ancestors, a ballroom shrouded in holland covers. And then on the fourth day, she discovered the library. She had been looking for it. How could a house this size not have a library? But Mrs. Bolton had somehow neglected to include it in the tour. Eleanor found it by accident, taking a wrong turn on her way back from the morning room. A door stood slightly ajar, and through it she glimpsed floor-to-ceiling shelves laden with books. Her heart leapt. Books. Finally, something familiar, something that might make this vast mausoleum feel like home. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, then stopped, simply staring. The library was magnificent, 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around the upper level, accessible by a graceful spiral staircase. Thousands upon thousands of books lined the walls, leather-bound, gilt-edged, organized with obvious care. Windows along one wall let in the afternoon light, and comfortable chairs were arranged near the fireplace. This, Eleanor thought, might be worth the price of this marriage. She moved along the shelves, trailing her fingers over the spines, reading titles. Philosophy, history, poetry, novels, scientific treatises, agricultural texts. The collection was comprehensive and eclectic, suggesting a mind that ranged widely in its interests. Were these Alexander's books? Or had they been collected by generations of thorns? She pulled down a volume of Byron and found a notation in the margin, a neat, masculine hand commenting on a particular passage. Her husband's handwriting, she guessed. So he did read, despite his apparent devotion to business and duty. "May I help you, Your Grace?" Eleanor spun around, dropping the book. A young man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He regarded her with curiosity rather than the cool judgment she had come to expect from the staff. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, bending to retrieve the fallen book. I didn't know." "You've every right to be here," the young man said, coming forward with a slight smile. "This is your library now. I'm Martin Hayes, His Grace's secretary. I often work in here when the Duke is away. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. I'm the one intruding, surely." "Nonsense." Hayes moved to the desk near the window, where papers were spread out in organized chaos. "His Grace mentioned, before he left, that you should have access to whatever you wished. The library included, naturally. Had he? That was something, at least. A small kindness in the midst of his abandonment." "It's a remarkable collection," Eleanor said, looking around with genuine appreciation. "His Grace has been building it since his youth. These," Hayes gestured to several shelves, "are books on agriculture and estate management. He's quite progressive in his thinking. Introduced crop rotation to his tenants 5 years ago. Invested in new machinery. The estate runs more efficiently than most in England." Eleanor moved to those shelves, genuinely interested. At Hartfield, she had managed what little remained of this estate after Thomas left for war. She understood the challenges of maintaining land and supporting tenants, even if on a much smaller scale than this. She pulled down a volume on modern farming techniques, opened it, and found herself absorbed. The margins were filled with notes in that same neat hand, observations, questions, calculations. This was a mind engaged with the world, thinking deeply about practical problems. "He's not what I expected," she murmured, not meaning to say it aloud. Hayes looked up from his papers. "In what way, Your Grace?" Eleanor flushed, embarrassed. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "Not at all. You hardly know him, after all. Though I can tell you that His Grace is one of the finest men I've ever served. He cares deeply about his responsibilities, about the people who depend on him, sometimes too deeply." There was something in Hayes's tone, a hint of concern, of protectiveness toward his employer. Eleanor wondered what it meant. What burdens did Alexander carry that his secretary worried over him? "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I should let you return to your work. Please, stay if you like. I promise not to disturb you. And if you have any questions about the collection, I'd be happy to help. I've cataloged most of it." So Eleanor stayed. She settled into one of the comfortable chairs with the agriculture book and lost herself in reading. It felt like the first normal thing she had done since arriving, simply sitting with a book, learning, thinking. No judgment here. No expectations. Just knowledge waiting to be absorbed. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the hours passing until Hayes politely coughed. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but it's nearly time to dress for dinner. I thought you might wish to know." Eleanor blinked, startled. The light outside had faded to dusk. She had been reading for 3 hours. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I lost track of time." "A sign of a good book," he said with a smile. "You're welcome here anytime, Your Grace." I think His Grace would be pleased to know the library is being used. It's been rather lonely since, he stopped himself. Since what? Hayes hesitated, then said carefully, His Grace has not spent much time here since returning from the war. Too many memories? Perhaps. Captain Ashby used to visit often. They would spend hours in here, arguing about politics and philosophy. His expression softened with remembered affection. Your brother had very decided opinions about everything. Eleanor's throat tightened. Yes, he did. I was sorry to learn of his death, Your Grace. We all were. His Grace took it very hard. So Alexander had loved Thomas too, had grieved for him, perhaps still grieved. That, at least, was something they shared, this terrible loss that had brought them together. That night, Eleanor carried the agriculture book to her room and read late into the night. And the next morning, she returned to the library, and the morning after that. It became her refuge, her sanctuary in this house, where she felt like a ghost haunting rooms that did not want her. She read about crop rotation and soil enrichment, about new breeds of sheep and modern irrigation techniques. She read poetry and philosophy, history and novels. She filled her days with learning, and if the nights were lonely, if she dined alone at that absurdly long table, if she slept in a bed too large for one person, at least she had this. This room full of knowledge, this one place in Ashworth Hall where she felt she belonged. On her 7th morning as Duchess of Ashworth, Eleanor was deep in a treatise on land drainage when she heard voices in the entrance hall below. Male voices, one of them familiar. Alexander had returned. Her hands tightened on the book. 7 days he had been gone. 7 days of silence, of absence, of abandonment. And now he was back, and she would have to face him, would have to pretend this marriage was something other than the farce they both knew it to be. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, the low murmur of his voice speaking to Hayes about some business matter. The footsteps paused outside the library door. Don't come in, Eleanor thought desperately. Let me have this place, at least. Don't take this for me too. But the door opened, and there he stood, her husband, still in his traveling clothes, looking tired and somehow older than she remembered. His eyes found her immediately, and something flickered in their depths. Surprise, perhaps. Or was it something else? Eleanor, he said, his voice rough from a road. I did not expect to find you here. She stood, the book clutched to her chest like armor. I apologize if I've disturbed your sanctuary, Your Grace. I can leave. No. The word came out sharper than he seemed to intend. He moderated his tone. No, please. Stay. I'm glad you found the library. It should be used. They stared at each other across the beautiful room, two strangers bound by vows and grief, neither knowing what to say. And in that moment, though neither of them knew it, something shifted. Alexander's gaze dropped to the book in Eleanor's hands, registered its title, and in his eyes appeared the first glimmer of genuine interest he had shown in her. You're reading about drainage systems? He asked, and there was a note of surprise, perhaps even curiosity, in his voice. I find them fascinating, Eleanor replied, lifting her chin, defensive. I managed my brother's estate for several years. I understand the importance of such practical matters. For the first time since their wedding, Alexander truly looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. And what he saw made him pause, made him wonder. Who, exactly, had he married? Alexander told himself his decision to remain at Ashworth Hall rather than return immediately to London was purely practical. Parliament would not reconvene for another month. His most pressing business matters had been resolved. The estate required his attention. There were repairs to authorize, tenant concerns to address, accounts to review. It made perfect sense to stay, to finally attend to responsibilities he had been neglecting since the war. That his sudden devotion to estate management coincided with his discovery of Eleanor in the library, absorbed in a book about agricultural improvements, was merely coincidence. Or so he told himself. He began taking breakfast at home rather than at his club in London. A reasonable decision, surely. Why waste hours traveling when he could accomplish more by staying put? The fact that Eleanor appeared in the breakfast room each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, that she wore simple gowns in soft colors that somehow suited her better than the gray she had worn at their wedding, that she had a habit of reading while she ate, none of this factored into his decision. On his third morning back, Alexander arrived in the breakfast room to find Eleanor already seated, a book propped against the marmalade pot, completely absorbed. She didn't notice him enter. He stood in the doorway for a moment, observing. She had tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. It had escaped from the simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, and she nibbled at a piece of toast absently, not really tasting it. Crumbs dotted the open pages of her book. Something about the scene struck him as unexpectedly charming. "Good morning," he said, perhaps more loudly than necessary. She startled, nearly knocking over her teacup. "Your Grace." "I apologize, I didn't hear you." She moved to close the book, to push it aside. "Please, don't stop on my account." He took his seat at the head of the table, nodding to the footman to serve him. "What are you reading?" She hesitated, as though expecting mockery. "A treatise on beekeeping. I noticed the old hives near the kitchen garden are abandoned. With proper management, they could produce honey again, and beeswax for candles. It would be more economical than purchasing." She stopped, flushing. "Forgive me. I'm sure you have no interest in such minutiae." But he found, surprisingly, that he did. "Continue. What would proper management entail?" Her eyes widened slightly, and then, for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but it transformed her face entirely. Her eyes lit with genuine enthusiasm, and suddenly Alexander saw what he had missed before. Eleanor was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but when she spoke of something that interested her, there was an animation, an intelligence in her features that was arresting. "Well," she said, leaning forward slightly, "it would require acquiring new colonies, of course, and ensuring the hives are properly situated. They should face south, sheltered from wind, but with access to flowering plants. I noticed the kitchen garden has been somewhat neglected, not Mrs. Bolton's fault, of course, but with no head gardener. Certain things have fallen into disrepair. If we were to restore it, plant more herbs and flowers, the bees would thrive. And the pollination they provide would improve the vegetable yields as well." She spoke with the confidence of someone who knew her subject thoroughly. Alexander found himself listening with genuine interest, asking questions, and before he knew it, half an hour had passed in easy conversation. When Eleanor finally noticed the time and excused herself, flustered at having talked so long, Alexander sat alone at the breakfast table and wondered why he felt oddly disappointed at her departure. Over the following days, he began to notice things about Eleanor he had been blind to before. She rose early, earlier even than him. He discovered this by chance when, unable to sleep one night, he went to the library at dawn and saw her through the window, walking in the gardens. She wore a shawl over her nightgown, her hair loose down her back, and she moved among the overgrown paths like a ghost, touching flowers, examining plants with the focused attention of someone who truly saw them. The next morning, he rose early deliberately and watched again. This time he saw her kneel beside a bed of struggling roses, pulling weeds with her bare hands, heedless of the dew soaking her hem. There was something almost reverent in the way she tended them, as though each plant deserved care and attention. Why did she do this? They had gardeners, admittedly not enough and poorly supervised, but surely the Duchess of Ashworth need not dirty her own hands in the flower beds. He asked Mrs. Bolton about it. "Oh, yes, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her tone still cool, but with a hint of grudging respect. "Her Grace spends an hour in the gardens most mornings. She's been speaking to old Henderson. You remember him, the undergardener who's mostly retired now? She's been asking his advice about restoring the gardens. I believe she's even been taking notes." Taking notes on gardening, as though it were a subject worthy of serious study. Alexander found himself drawn to the windows that overlooked the gardens at odd hours, watching Eleanor work. She had recruited 2 of the younger footmen to help her, and he observed as she directed them with quiet authority, here to prune, there to stake, this bed to be cleared and replanted. The young men seemed bemused at first, but she won them over with patient explanation and genuine gratitude for their help. "My brother always said that gardens were like people," he overheard her tell one of them. "They need attention and care to flourish. Neglect them and they grow wild. But even wild things have their own beauty, don't you think?" The footman, a boy of perhaps 18, nodded eagerly, clearly charmed. Alexander was not charmed. Of course not. He was merely interested, curious about this stranger he had married, who seemed to care more about abandoned rose bushes than her own comfort. He began finding excuses to walk through the gardens himself. He told himself it was to inspect Eleanor's progress, to see if her efforts were yielding results. He did not acknowledge that he timed these walks to coincide with her presence there. "Your Grace," she said, startled, when he appeared one afternoon. She was on her knees in a flower bed, her hands black with soil, her face flushed from exertion. Several tendrils of hair had escaped to curl around her face. "I didn't expect, that is, I hope I haven't overstepped. I should have asked permission before making changes." "You're the Duchess," Alexander interrupted. "These are your gardens. You need no one's permission." She looked at him uncertainly, as though trying to determine if he was sincere or mocking her. He realized with some chagrin that he had given her no reason to expect kindness from him. "They're coming along nicely," he said more gently. "The roses especially. My mother loved roses." "Did she?" Eleanor's face softened. "I wondered. There are so many varieties here. Someone clearly chose them with great care." "She planned these gardens herself. Before." He stopped. "Before she died, when I was 12. Before this house became a mausoleum instead of a home." Eleanor seemed to understand what he couldn't say. "I'll do my best to honor her vision," she said quietly. Something in his chest tightened. He nodded brusquely and walked away, unsettled by the emotion that had risen so unexpectedly. But he came back the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes Eleanor was there, sometimes not. But either way, he found himself walking those paths she was slowly reclaiming from wilderness, seeing them through her eyes, not as they were, but as they could be. It was on one of these walks that he encountered young Timmy, the smallest of the footmen, carefully transplanting seedlings under Eleanor's supervision. "That's it, gentle now," Eleanor was saying. "Plants are like small children, I suppose. They need a firm hand, but a gentle touch." "Yes, Your Grace," Timmy said, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated. Alexander watched from behind a hedge, feeling oddly like a spy in his own gardens. Eleanor's patience with the boy was remarkable. She didn't criticize when he fumbled, didn't show frustration when he had to be shown the same technique 3 times. She simply persevered, encouraging, teaching. How had he not noticed this about her? This capacity for gentleness, for bringing out the best in others? That evening at dinner, they had begun taking the meal together, a development Alexander had suggested almost without thinking. He mentioned what he had seen. "You're kind to the servants," he said abruptly, "between the fish and the roast." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "They work very hard. Kindness costs nothing. Many ladies of your position would not agree. They prefer to maintain distance, to rule through intimidation rather than respect." "That seems inefficient," Eleanor said with a slight frown. "People work better when they feel valued, don't you think? And besides, what right have I to demand respect I haven't earned? She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm new to this position. I have much to learn. It seems foolish to pretend otherwise." Alexander found himself seeing her again with new eyes. Where he had initially perceived inadequacy, he now saw humility and wisdom. She knew her limitations and worked within them rather than pretending to a sophistication she didn't possess. It was, he realized, rather admirable. "You're settling in well," he heard himself say. "Better than I expected." The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. They sounded condescending, insulting even. But Eleanor merely smiled that small, tentative smile. "Thank you, Your Grace. I'm trying." "Alexander," he said. "Please." "We agreed you would call me Alexander." "Alexander," she repeated softly, and the sound of his name in her voice did something strange to his pulse. He began to notice other things, small things. The way she always thanked the servants by name. How she had befriended Mrs. Bolton's cat, a fierce mouser that tolerated no one, and could be found most afternoons curled in Eleanor's lap while she read in the library. The way she hummed tunelessly under her breath when she thought no one was listening. He noticed that she wore the same 6 dresses in rotation, simple, well-made, but clearly not new, and certainly not fashionable by London standards. It occurred to him that she probably owned nothing else, that the modest fortune he had settled on her was still unspent because Eleanor had no idea what to do with such wealth. He found Hayes in the library one afternoon. "Has my wife requested any funds?" "For clothing, jewelry, personal items." Hayes looked up from his ledgers. "No, Your Grace. Not a penny beyond the household accounts she reviews with Mrs. Bolton. Send for the modiste from London, Madame Rousseau. Tell her to bring her finest fabrics and fashion plates. And a jeweler, Rundell and Bridge. Her Grace needs a proper wardrobe." "Of course, Your Grace." Hayes hesitated. "If I may say so, sir, you seem different since your return." "Different how?" "More present, perhaps. Less haunted." Alexander frowned. "I don't know what you mean." But he did. For months after returning from the war, after Thomas's death, he had been going through the motions of living without really being alive. Duty had sustained him, nothing more. Food had no taste, music no beauty, conversation no interest. Now suddenly, he found himself looking forward to mornings, to breakfast conversations about beekeeping and soil composition, to glimpses of Eleanor in the garden, her hands dirty and her face peaceful, to dinners where they talked of books and estate management, agriculture and philosophy. He realized with a start, enjoying his wife's company. When had that happened? It was late one night, unable to sleep, that Alexander discovered Eleanor's nocturnal habits. He had gone to the library for a book, or so he told himself, though in truth he simply felt restless, and found a light burning. Eleanor sat curled in one of the large chairs near the fireplace, wearing her nightgown and wrapper, her bare feet tucked beneath her, reading by candlelight. She looked up when he entered, eyes wide. "I'm sorry I couldn't sleep. I didn't mean to." "Neither could I," Alexander said. He should leave. It was improper, being alone with her like this, both of them in night clothes. But he found he didn't want to leave. He settled into the chair opposite hers. "What are you reading?" She showed him the spine. Byron. The same volume he had annotated years ago. "I've been reading your notes," she said shyly. "In the margins. You have interesting observations." Those were written by an arrogant young man who thought he understood the world. "And now I know I understand very little." He paused. "What do you think of Byron?" And so they talked there in the firelit library in the deep hours of the night about poetry and passion, about Byron's romanticism and his cynicism, about the nature of love and loss. Eleanor spoke with an intelligence that surprised and delighted him, challenging his interpretations, offering insights he had never considered. When she finally yawned, covering her mouth with her hand, Alexander realized hours had passed. The candles had burned low, and the fire had died to embers. "We should both try to sleep," he said, rising reluctantly. "Yes." She stood as well, and they walked together to the door. In the corridor outside, lit only by the few candles left burning overnight, she turned to him. "Thank you, Alexander, for this, for talking with me. I've missed intellectual conversation." "As have I," he admitted. She smiled at him, a real smile this time, warm and unguarded, and something in Alexander's chest constricted painfully. He watched her walk away down the corridor toward her apartments, and only when she disappeared from view did he realize he had been holding his breath. What was happening to him? He had married Eleanor out of duty, installed her in his home as payment of a debt, and intended to live alongside her in polite, distant courtesy. Instead, he found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering what she was doing, what she was reading, whether she would be in the gardens or the library, seeking her out with increasing frequency, inventing reasons to speak with her, to be near her. This was not supposed to happen. Alexander retreated to his own chambers and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand the strange pull he felt toward the woman sleeping in the Duchess's apartments. The woman he had married without wanting, without knowing, without even really seeing. The woman who, somehow, had become the most fascinating person in his world. The crisis came in the form of fire. Alexander was in his study reviewing correspondence when young Timmy burst through the door, wild-eyed and panting. "Your Grace." "The tenant cottages, Miller's Row. There's a fire." Alexander was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering. Miller's Row housed 6 families, including the Hendersons with their 4 young children and old Mrs. Graves, who was bedridden. Have the fire bells been rung? Is everyone out? I don't know, Your Grace. I came straight here when I saw the smoke. But Alexander was already moving, shouting orders as he ran. Alert the stables. We need every able-bodied man with buckets. Send riders to the neighboring estates for help. He took the stairs 3 at a time, racing toward the sound of alarm bells, now clanging frantically. Outside, black smoke billowed into the afternoon sky from the direction of the tenant cottages 1/2 mile distant. Alexander ran, his lungs burning, cursing himself for not keeping a fire wagon on the estate, for not drilling the tenants in fire safety, for every possible failure that might cost lives. When he reached Miller's Row, chaos greeted him. 2 cottages were fully engulfed, flames leaping from roof to roof. Men threw buckets of water that seemed to evaporate before reaching the blaze. Women clutched children weeping. And there, in the midst of it all, stood Eleanor. She had organized the women and older children into a bucket brigade from the well, directing them with calm authority. Keep the line moving. Don't waste water on the burning cottages. Wet down the others to stop it spreading. You there, take those children further back, away from the smoke. Eleanor. Alexander shouted over the roar of flames. What are you doing here? She turned to him, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes clear and focused. I was visiting Mrs. Henderson when the fire started. Everyone's out safely, thank God, but we're losing ground. The wind is pushing it toward the other cottages. Alexander assessed the situation with a soldier's eye. She was right. The wind was the enemy here. If it pushed the flames to the remaining 4 cottages, they would lose the entire row. We need to create a fire break. Pull down the fence between Henderson's and Graves' cottages. Soak the ground, the walls, everything. I'll organize the women, Eleanor said immediately, already moving. For the next 2 hours, they fought. Alexander worked alongside his men, pulling down fences, hauling buckets, beating at flames with wet blankets. Beside him, Eleanor never faltered. She coordinated the water supply, tended burns, calmed frightened children, all while keeping her head in a crisis that would have sent most ladies of quality fleeing to their chambers with smelling salts. When riders arrived from the neighboring estates with more men and equipment, the tide began to turn. By dusk, the fire was contained, though 2 cottages had burned to the ground and a 3rd was badly damaged. Alexander stood in the smoke-hazed twilight, his clothes ruined, his hands blistered, and watched Eleanor kneeling beside old Mrs. Graves, wrapping a blanket around her frail shoulders and speaking to her in low, comforting tones. Your Grace, his estate manager, Preston, appeared at his elbow. Thank God everyone survived. If Her Grace hadn't been here when it started, hadn't gotten people organized immediately, we might have lost lives. How did it start? Henderson's boy was smoking in the stable, dropped his pipe in the hay. The fool. Preston shook his head. The families will need housing, Your Grace, and compensation for what they lost. Put them in the servants' wing at the hall for now. Empty rooms enough there. And see that they have everything they need, clothes, food, furniture. I'll speak to the solicitors about rebuilding. Very good, Your Grace. When Preston left, Alexander walked toward Eleanor. She had moved on from Mrs. Graves and was now helping Mrs. Henderson comfort her weeping children, promising them that everything would be all right, that they would have a new home soon. Eleanor, Alexander said quietly. She looked up at him, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Her hair had come completely undone, hanging in tangled waves around her soot-stained face. Her dress was ruined, hem scorched and soaked. She had a burn on her left hand that she hadn't mentioned. She was, Alexander thought, with startling clarity, magnificent. We should return to the hall, he said. You're injured. She glanced at her hand as though noticing the burn for the first time. It's nothing. But yes, we should get these families settled. They're in shock. They walked back together, surrounded by the displaced tenants. Eleanor held young Susie Henderson's hand, telling her stories to distract her from the trauma, while Alexander carried the girl's younger brother on his shoulders. It felt oddly natural, this partnership, as though they had been working together for years rather than mere weeks. At the hall, Eleanor took charge of settling the families. She had Mrs. Bolton prepare rooms, ordered hot baths and meals, found clothing for everyone. She moved through it all with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before they were voiced, soothing fears with gentle words and practical help. Alexander watched her, mesmerized. This was not the shy, uncertain woman who had first arrived at Ashworth Hall. This was Eleanor in her element, capable, compassionate, strong. It was nearly midnight before she finally stopped moving. Alexander found her in the housekeeper's sitting room, collapsed in a chair, staring at nothing. "You should rest," he said from the doorway. She looked up, and he saw exhaustion in every line of her face. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. If the children had been trapped, if the fire had spread faster." He came into the room, closing the door behind him. Propriety be damned. They needed this conversation. But they weren't. Everyone survived because you acted quickly and kept your head. You saved lives today, Eleanor. I only did what was necessary. Most people freeze in a crisis. You didn't. He sat across from her, leaning forward. Where did you learn to manage like that? To organize people under pressure? She smiled faintly, sadly. Necessity, I suppose. When our mother was dying, I managed the household and her care while Thomas was away at war. And after she died, when the creditors came and the estate began to fail, I learned to make hard decisions quickly, to keep moving even when I wanted to fall apart. Alexander heard the echo of his own experience in her words. That's what war teaches you as well. Keep moving. Don't think about what you've lost or what might come. Just focus on the next task, the next moment. Thomas used to write to me about that, Eleanor said softly. About how battle was mostly terror and confusion, but you had to push through it. Do what needed doing even when you were terrified. At the mention of Thomas, something shifted in the air between them. They had been avoiding this, the ghost that had brought them together, but stood between them as well. Tell me about him, Alexander said quietly. About Thomas before the war. I knew the soldier, the officer. But you knew the brother, the boy he was. Eleanor's eyes grew distant with memory. He was impossible, headstrong and brave, and so certain he was right about everything. But he was also the kindest person I knew. When I was small, other children mocked me for being too serious, too bookish. Thomas defended me, told me my mind was my greatest gift, and I should never apologize for it. That sounds like him, Alexander said, smiling despite the ache in his chest. He once punched a fellow officer for making a crude jest about women's intellect. Nearly got court-martialed for it. Did he? Eleanor laughed, a sound both joyful and heartbroken. Yes, that's very Thomas. He spoke of you often, Alexander continued. Worried about you. Wanted you to be happy, to find someone who would value you as you deserved. Eleanor's expression crumpled slightly. Instead, I became an obligation foisted on his best friend. I'm sorry, Alexander. This cannot be what he wanted for either of us. No, Alexander agreed. But I think he would be pleased to see how you conducted yourself today. Your courage, your compassion. You honored his memory better than any monument could. She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and in them he saw reflected his own grief, his own guilt. Do you blame yourself, she asked, for his death? The question, so direct, so insightful, took him off guard. He wanted to deflect, to deny, but he found he couldn't lie to her. Not after today. Not after she had shown him such truth. Yes, he said hoarsely. Every day. The bullet that killed him was meant for me. I saw the French soldier aim, saw Thomas move. He pushed me aside and took the shot himself. He died saving my life. And I failed to save his. Alexander, no. Eleanor leaned forward, and to his shock, took his blistered hands in hers. The touch burned, not from his injuries, but from the simple human connection he had denied himself for so long. You cannot think that. Thomas chose to save you. He made that choice freely, as a soldier and as a friend. You dishonor his sacrifice by carrying this guilt. How could I not? Alexander's voice cracked. I'm alive because he's dead. Every breath I take is one he doesn't. Every day I waste, every moment I fail to live fully, is an insult to what he gave up. Then live, Eleanor said fiercely, gripping his hands tighter. Live fully and well. Make his sacrifice mean something by being the man he believed you to be. That's the only way to honor him, not by drowning in guilt, but by living the life he wanted for you. Alexander stared at her, this woman he had thought he knew, thought he understood, and realized he had been blind. She was not weak or simple or merely dutiful. She was steel wrapped in softness, strength disguised as gentleness. She had suffered losses as great as his own, brother, mother, home, independence, and yet she had not broken. She had bent, adapted, found ways to keep moving forward. She was extraordinary. "How are you so wise?" he whispered. "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being sad." She released his hands, suddenly seeming to realize the intimacy of the gesture, and sat back. Thomas wouldn't want us drowning in grief. He'd want us to find joy, to build something good from the wreckage he left behind. "Is that what we're doing?" "Building something." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I don't know." "What are we doing, Alexander?" It was a question he couldn't answer, because he didn't know himself. All he knew was that somewhere between the fire and this conversation, between watching her work tirelessly for people she barely knew and seeing her speak his own secret guilt aloud, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer simply tolerating his wife's presence. He was seeking it, craving it. The thought of her consumed him at odd hours. He found himself remembering small things, the way she hummed while gardening, the crease between her brows when she read something puzzling, the exact shade of her eyes in candlelight. This was dangerous. This was not what he had agreed to. This marriage was supposed to be duty, obligation, nothing more. But duty did not make his pulse race when she entered a room. Obligation did not explain why he lay awake thinking about the curve of her neck or the rare brightness of her smile. "I don't know," he finally said, answering her question and his own spiraling thoughts at once. "But I think we should find out." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there made her nod slowly. "All right," she said softly. "All right." They sat in silence after that, but it was not the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was something else, tentative, fragile, but real. A beginning, perhaps, of something neither had expected to find. When Alexander finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Eleanor. For today. For everything." "We're partners in this, aren't we?" she said. "Whatever this is." "Yes," Alexander agreed. "Partners." But as he walked through the darkened corridors to his chambers, he knew it was already more than partnership he felt. The fascination that had been growing over the past weeks had crystallized into something deeper, more unsettling. He was becoming obsessed with his own wife, and he had no idea what to do about it. Alexander discovered that obsession crept in quietly, disguising itself as curiosity until it was too late to resist. It began with small observations. He learned that Eleanor woke every morning at 5:30, before even the kitchen maid stirred. That she took her tea with honey, but no milk. That she touched the spines of books before selecting one, as though greeting old friends. That she had a small scar on her right hand from a childhood accident involving rose thorns. These facts accumulated in his mind like treasures, precious and inexplicable. He found himself timing his movements to coincide with hers. Breakfasts that had once been solitary affairs now required his presence at precisely 8 o'clock. His morning rides through the estate somehow always passed by the gardens where Eleanor worked. He developed a sudden interest in the library's organization, which necessitated spending hours in proximity to wherever she happened to be reading. "Your Grace seems much more engaged with the estate," Hayes observed one afternoon, a hint of amusement in his voice. Alexander looked up from the accounts he was pretending to review while actually watching Eleanor through the window. She was showing young Susie Henderson how to deadhead roses, her patience infinite as the child fumbled with the shears. "I've been neglecting my responsibilities," Alexander said, turning back to the ledgers. "It's past time I attended to them properly." "Of course, Your Grace." Hayes's tone suggested he wasn't fooled. The rebuilding of Miller's Row became Alexander's personal project. He could have delegated it entirely to Preston, as he had delegated most estate matters for the past 2 years. Instead, he visited the site daily, reviewing plans, consulting with builders, and, not coincidentally, often encountering Eleanor, who had made it her mission to ensure the displaced families felt cared for during the reconstruction. "The Hendersons will need a larger cottage this time," Eleanor said one afternoon as they stood amid the construction. They have 4 children and another on the way. And Mrs. Graves' cottage should be on the ground floor. Those stairs were too much for her even before the fire. Alexander made notes, struck by how thoroughly she had considered each family's needs. You've thought of everything. They're people, not problems to be solved, Eleanor said, watching the builders frame the new structures. Each has different circumstances, different needs. We should build accordingly. We, Alexander noted, not for the first time. She said we now when speaking of the estate of its people. She had claimed ownership not of his wealth or title, but of the responsibility that came with them. It made something warm unfurl in his chest. He began watching her more deliberately. From his study window, he could see into the gardens, and he found himself drawn there repeatedly throughout the day. Eleanor had transformed those neglected spaces with patient determination. The rose garden bloomed again under her care. The kitchen garden produced vegetables for the hall's table. Even the wild areas she left untamed had a planned beauty to them, as though she understood that cultivation and wildness could coexist. She was always in motion, pruning, planting, directing the footmen she had recruited to help her. But there were moments of stillness, too. Sometimes she would pause beside a particularly beautiful rose and simply stand there, her face soft with appreciation, breathing in its scent. Once, he saw her sit on a bench in the shade and close her eyes, letting the afternoon sun warm her face, a small smile playing on her lips. In those unguarded moments, she was heartbreakingly lovely. Alexander tried to rationalize his preoccupation. She was his wife. Naturally, he would take an interest in her welfare. She was transforming his estate for the better. Of course, he would notice her efforts. She was intelligent and capable. Any reasonable person would find that admirable. But reason had nothing to do with the way his heart kicked against his ribs when she entered a room. Logic did not explain why the sound of her humming made him smile. And there was no rational justification for the fact that he had taken to carrying a handkerchief she had left behind in the library, or that he sometimes pulled it from his pocket just to catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to it. He was losing his mind. Dinners became both torment and salvation. They dined together now every evening, a practice that had evolved naturally from their tentative partnership. Alexander found himself anticipating these meals with an eagerness that was entirely inappropriate for what were merely domestic arrangements. Eleanor had begun to relax in his company. She no longer started when he spoke, no longer seemed to measure every word before releasing it. Instead, she talked freely about the books she was reading, the improvements she wanted to make to the estate, questions she had about agricultural theory. Her mind was extraordinary, making connections he would never have considered, challenging his assumptions with gentle logic. You're arguing that crop rotation is less efficient than mixed cultivation, he said one evening, genuinely surprised. Not less efficient, differently efficient, Eleanor corrected, leaning forward in her enthusiasm. Her eyes sparkled in the candlelight. Rotation prevents soil depletion, yes, but mixed cultivation, planting complementary crops together, can improve yields while reducing pest damage. The beans fix nitrogen that the corn needs, while the corn provides structure for the beans to climb. Each plant supports the other. Symbiosis, Alexander murmured, transfixed not by the agricultural theory, but by the passion in her voice, the animation in her features. Exactly. Nature has already solved many of the problems we're trying to address through rotation. We just need to observe and learn from it. He loved how her hands moved when she spoke about something that excited her, gesturing to illustrate her points. Loved the way she forgot to be self-conscious, forgot that she was supposed to be merely tolerated in this marriage. In these moments, she was fully herself, brilliant, passionate, alive. He wanted more of those moments. Wanted to be the one who brought that light to her eyes. The wanting was becoming a problem. At night, alone in his chambers, Alexander lay awake thinking about the woman sleeping in the Duchess's apartments. What did she wear to bed? Did she read before sleeping, as she did in the library? Did she think about him at all, or was he merely the Duke, the distant husband who had given her security but nothing else? The questions tormented him. He began finding excuses to touch her. Nothing improper. They were married, after all, and these were the innocent contacts permitted by society. A hand at her elbow when helping her into the carriage. his palm at the small of her back when guiding her through a doorway, their fingers brushing when both reached for the same book. Each touch burned. Each brief contact left him craving more. She seemed unaware of the effect she had on him, still treated him with friendly courtesy, as one would a respected colleague or distant relation. Still called him Alexander, in that soft voice that made his name sound like a prayer. Still smiled at him with warmth, but nothing deeper. It was driving him mad. "You're brooding again," his sister Cecilia observed when she visited unexpectedly one afternoon. She swept into his study with characteristic energy, her fashionable gown and elaborate coiffure a stark contrast to Eleanor's simple elegance. "And you've been avoiding London. People are beginning to wonder if you've forgotten civilization exists." "I've been busy with estate matters," Alexander said, rising to greet her properly. Cecilia's sharp eyes assessed him. "Estate matters. Is that what we're calling it?" She settled into a chair, studying him with unnerving intensity. "Where is this wife of yours? I'm dying to meet the woman who managed to get you to the altar." "Eleanor is in the gardens, I believe." "Of course she is. I heard about her little gardening project. And the fire. And how she's befriended every servant and tenant within 5 miles. Cecilia's expression softened slightly. "She sounds rather wonderful, actually. Not at all what I expected." "What did you expect? Some timid little mouse you'd married out of pity. But from what I hear, your Duchess is far from timid." Mrs. Bolton actually smiled when speaking of her. I nearly fainted from the shock. Alexander felt an absurd swell of pride. "Eleanor has a gift for bringing out the best in people." "Eleanor, is it? Not my wife or the Duchess." Cecilia leaned forward, eyes glinting with interest. "Brother dear, I do believe you're smitten." "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm never ridiculous. I am, however, extremely perceptive. And you, Alexander Thorne, are a man thoroughly besotted with his own wife. Was it that obvious? Could everyone see what he had barely admitted to himself? It's not. We're not." He couldn't find the words to explain the complicated truth of his marriage. "Oh, this is delicious," Cecilia said gleefully. "Does she know? Have you told her how you feel?" "There's nothing to tell. We're partners in managing the estate, nothing more." "Partners." Cecilia laughed outright. "You keep telling yourself that, dear brother. Meanwhile, I'm going to meet this remarkable woman who has you tied in knots." She swept out, leaving Alexander alone with his treacherous thoughts. That evening at dinner, with Cecilia monopolizing the conversation and clearly interrogating Eleanor under the guise of friendly interest, Alexander watched his wife handle his sister's probing questions with grace and gentle humor. She neither boasted nor diminished herself, answered honestly but without revealing too much, and somehow charmed Cecilia completely within the span of 3 courses. "I like her," Cecilia announced after Eleanor had excused herself to check on the Henderson children. "She's genuine, intelligent, kind, and she hasn't the faintest idea you're in love with her." Alexander's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. "I never said." "You didn't have to. It's written all over your face every time you look at her." Cecilia's expression turned serious. "Alexander, why haven't you told her?" "Because this marriage was never meant to be a love match. She accepted it as an obligation, a rescue from poverty. I won't trap her further by burdening her with unwanted feelings." "Unwanted? Are you certain of that?" "She treats me with respect and friendliness. Nothing more." "Perhaps because that's all you've shown her," Cecilia suggested gently. "Alexander, you're so busy protecting yourself from potential rejection that you're guaranteeing it. Eleanor can't respond to feelings she doesn't know exist." Her words haunted him after she departed the next day. Was Cecilia right? Was he sabotaging his own chance at happiness through cowardice disguised as consideration? But what if he told Eleanor how he felt and she recoiled? What if this tentative friendship they had built crumbled under the weight of his inappropriate obsession? Better to suffer in silence than risk losing what little they had. And yet, he found himself in the library late that night, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking. Eleanor appeared an hour later, wrapped in her dressing gown, seeking the same solace in books that he did. "I'm sorry," she said when she saw him. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding. Join me." She settled into her customary chair, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, reading. Or rather, Eleanor read. Alexander pretended to read while actually watching her over the top of his book, memorizing the curve of her neck, the way candlelight caught in her dark hair, the unconscious grace of her movements. "Your sister is lovely," Eleanor said eventually, though rather intimidating. "She liked you very much. Said you were genuine." Eleanor smiled. "High praise indeed, though I suspect she was assessing whether I was good enough for her beloved brother." If only she knew it was the reverse, that Alexander lay awake wondering if he could ever be worthy of her quiet strength, her generous spirit. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped, unsure what he meant to say. She looked up, meeting his eyes with that clear, steady gaze that always undid him. "Yes. Tell her," a voice whispered in his mind. "Tell her you think of nothing but her, that she has become essential as breathing, that what began as duty has transformed into desperate need." But he couldn't. The risk was too great. "Sleep well," he said instead, and hated himself for his cowardice. As he lay in bed that night, Eleanor's image burned behind his closed eyes. This could not continue. He was consumed, obsessed, teetering on the edge of madness. Something would have to give. He just prayed that when it did, he wouldn't destroy the fragile thing they had built together. The storm arrived without warning, as autumn storms often did in the countryside. Alexander had ridden out to inspect the progress on Miller's Row, despite the threatening sky. The new cottages were nearly complete, and he wanted to ensure everything met his specifications before the families moved back. He was examining the stonework on Mrs. Graves' cottage when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it became a deluge. "Your Grace," Preston shouted over the sudden roar of rain. "We need to take shelter." But Alexander was already running, not toward the construction sheds, but toward the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the estate. It was closer, and if the lightning now splitting the sky was any indication, they needed cover immediately. He burst through the door of the small stone cottage, soaked to the skin, and stopped short. Eleanor was there. She stood near the fireplace, equally drenched, her hair plastered to her face, and her simple day dress clinging to her figure in ways that made Alexander's mouth go dry. She had clearly been caught in the storm during one of her walks. "Alexander," she pressed a hand to her chest. "You frightened me. I thought I was alone." "I was at the building site. The storm came up so fast," he broke off, acutely aware that they were alone, wet, and stranded together in a one-room cottage with a single narrow bed in the corner. Thunder crashed overhead, making the windows rattle. The rain hammered against the roof with such violence that conversation became nearly impossible. Eleanor moved toward the fireplace, where a small stack of dry wood waited. The gamekeeper kept it supplied for exactly these emergencies. "We should start a fire," she said, kneeling. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the kindling. From cold or nervousness, Alexander couldn't tell. He joined her, striking the flint. The fire caught quickly, spreading warmth into the small space. They both moved closer to it, drawn by the heat and the need to do something, anything, other than acknowledge the intimacy of their situation. "We'll have to wait it out," Alexander said, staring into the flames. "This kind of storm usually passes in an hour or two." "Yes." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Her lips had taken on a faint blue tinge. Without thinking, Alexander shrugged out of his silk coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was as wet as her dress, but it was something, a gesture of care, if not actual warmth. "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'll be fine." He moved to the small window, putting distance between them because proximity felt dangerous just now. Rain lashed against the glass in horizontal sheets. The world beyond had disappeared into gray fury. They were truly trapped, alone together with nowhere to escape, nothing to distract them from each other. "This cottage," Eleanor said after a moment, breaking the tense silence. "It's charming, small but well built. My grandfather used it when he hunted these woods. I played here as a boy, pretending it was my fortress." Alexander smiled at the memory. "Thomas and I spent an entire summer here once, when we were 12. Thought we were terribly independent, living off the land." "How long did that last?" 3 days. We missed real food, too much." He turned from the window to find her watching him, firelight dancing across her features. Thomas could make anything an adventure, even a child's game of make-believe. He wrote to me about you, Eleanor said softly. From the war. Said you were the best man he knew. That he trusted you with his life. The words cut deep. And I failed that trust. No. Eleanor stood, moving toward him with surprising intensity. Alexander, you have to stop carrying this guilt. Thomas made his choice. You didn't fail him. He succeeded in saving someone he loved. Don't diminish his sacrifice by refusing to accept it. They were standing close now, close enough that Alexander could see water droplets caught in her eyelashes, could feel the warmth radiating from her despite her wet clothes. This was dangerous. This proximity, this privacy, the way she was looking at him with such fierce compassion. You don't understand, he said roughly. Every day since his death, I've been haunted. By his memory, by my guilt, by the debt I owe. And then I married you to honor his dying wish, and I thought, he stopped himself, the words coming too close to confession. You thought what? Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Tell her. The storm roared around them, isolating them from the world, creating a space outside normal rules. Tell her everything. I thought it would ease the guilt, he said instead, choosing a safer truth. That honoring his request would bring me peace. But it hasn't. Instead you're trapped with an unwanted wife, Eleanor finished, her voice suddenly flat. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself again. I understand, Alexander. You don't need to pretend otherwise. No, that's not. He reached for her arm, stopping her retreat. Eleanor, you're not unwanted, aren't I? She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw pain he had put there. You married me out of obligation. You fled to London the day after our wedding. You avoid me except when duty demands otherwise. I see the way you look at me sometimes, as though trying to find Thomas in my features and being disappointed when you can't. That's not why I look at you, Alexander said, his grip tightening on her arm. Then why? The question hung between them, a challenge and a plea. The truth hovered on his tongue, desperate to escape. Because you've become my obsession. Because I think of nothing but you. Because the sight of you makes my heart race, and your absence leaves me hollow. Because somewhere between duty and partnership, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you. But the words wouldn't come. Fear strangled them. Fear of rejection, of destroying what they had built, of being vulnerable in ways he hadn't allowed himself since the war. I look at you because you're my wife, he said finally. The answer both true and utterly inadequate. Because you're part of my life now. Eleanor's expression shuddered. I see. She pulled away from his grip, moving back toward the fire. Part of your life. Like the estate or your duties in Parliament. Another responsibility to be managed. Eleanor. It's all right, Alexander. She didn't look at him, staring instead into the flames. I knew what this marriage was when I accepted it. I'm grateful for your protection, for the home you've given me. I don't expect more. But he could hear the lie in her words, see it in the rigid set of her shoulders. She did expect more, or at least she had hoped for it. And he, with his cowardice and his caution, had taught her not to hope. You deserve more, he heard himself say. Do I? Now she did turn, and the vulnerability in her face nearly undid him. Sometimes I think, but no, I'm being foolish. What do you think? He moved closer, drawn by the need to understand, to know her thoughts even as he hid his own. She laughed, a broken sound. I think that sometimes when we talk in the library or work together on the estate, I forget this marriage is merely convenient. I forget that you're only tolerating my presence. And then I remember, and she shook her head. Forgive me. The storm being trapped here, it's making me maudlin. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. She felt something. Not love, perhaps, but something beyond mere acceptance. The knowledge thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. I don't tolerate your presence, he said, his voice rough. I seek it. Eleanor's eyes widened. What? I seek it, he repeated, moving closer still, drawn by a force he could no longer resist. I time my days around yours. I invent reasons to be near you. I watch you in the gardens from my study window, like some lovesick fool. I lie awake thinking about you, wondering what you're reading, what you're thinking, whether you. He stopped, appalled at himself. He had said too much, revealed too much. The words hung between them, damning and desperate. Eleanor stared at him. Her lips parted in shock. You watch me. Yes. There was no point in lying now. I know you wake at 5:30. That you hum when you garden. That you read with your feet tucked beneath you. I know you prefer honey in your tea, and that you have a scar on your right hand from rose thorns. I know that when you smile, truly smile, not that polite expression you give the servants, your whole face transforms, and I cannot breathe. The confession tumbled out, unstoppable, now that it had begun. Eleanor's expression shifted from shock to something else, something Alexander couldn't read. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because I'm going mad, he said harshly. Because you asked why I look at you, and I cannot lie anymore. Because being trapped here with you, being this close, and not being able to. He cut himself off, but too late. The truth was out, raw and terrifying. Not being able to what? Eleanor's voice was steady, but her eyes were wide, searching his face. Kiss you. Touch you. Claim you as mine in truth, not just in name. But he couldn't say it. To voice such desires would cross a line from which there was no return, would transform this marriage from a careful partnership into something dangerous and real. I should go, he said instead, moving toward the door. The rain is. It's still pouring. Eleanor caught his arm, stopping him. Alexander, please. Don't run from this. From me. You don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. Frustration sharpened her voice. Stop treating me like I'm fragile. Stop hiding behind duty and propriety. I'm your wife, Alexander. We're married. If you feel something beyond obligation, why won't you? Because I'm terrified. The words exploded from him. Because this was never supposed to happen. I was never supposed to want you like this, to need you, to lie awake aching for you. You were supposed to be a duty, a promise kept, nothing more. And instead, you've become. What? Eleanor stepped closer, her hand still on his arm, her face tilted up to his. What have I become? Everything. The word burned in his throat, but fear held it back. If he said it, if he confessed the full depth of his obsession, she could reject him, could look at him with pity or disgust, could confirm every fear that whispered in the dark that he was unworthy, that his feelings were unwanted. I can't, he whispered, hating himself for his cowardice. Eleanor, I can't. Her hand fell away, and in her eyes he saw hurt bloom. I see. You can confess to watching me, to thinking of me, but you cannot finish what you've started. You can crack open the door, but not step through it. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple, Eleanor said, her voice trembling now. Either you want this marriage to be real, or you don't. Either I am your wife in truth, or I'm merely the woman you installed in your house to ease your conscience. But I cannot live in this half-state anymore, Alexander. I cannot bear these hints and suggestions and almost confessions. I need to know where I stand. The demand was fair. More than fair. She deserved honesty, deserved to know his heart. But terror clamped his throat shut. The words wouldn't come. Eleanor waited, hope and hurt warring in her expression. When he remained silent, something in her face closed off. Very well, she said quietly. I have my answer. She turned away from him, moving to the far side of the small cottage, putting as much distance between them as the space allowed. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain continued its assault. But the storm inside the cottage was worse, a tempest of unspoken words and unexpressed longing, of cowardice and misunderstanding. They waited out the weather in terrible silence, both too hurt and too proud to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. When the rain finally eased, they walked back to the hall separately, the physical distance mirroring the emotional gulf that Alexander's fear had created. He had come so close to confession, had balanced on the edge of vulnerability, and had chosen safety over truth. As he watched Eleanor disappear into the house ahead of him, Alexander knew he had made a terrible mistake. But he didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to silence the fear that told him love was too dangerous, that opening his heart would only lead to more loss. So he did what he had always done when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He retreated. The invitations arrived 3 days after the storm, elegant cards on thick cream paper announcing that Lady Hartley and her house guests would be calling at Ashworth Hall. Alexander stared at them with a sinking sensation. Lady Hartley was a neighbor whose estate bordered his own, a society matron who had been trying to draw him back into the social fold since his return from war. He had successfully avoided her thus far, but Eleanor's presence changed everything. The Duchess of Ashworth could not remain hidden away indefinitely. Society would demand its due. "Will you receive them?" Hayes asked, watching Alexander's face. "We must." Alexander set the cards aside with resignation. Eleanor should be introduced to the local families. It's only proper. What he didn't say was that the thought of sharing Eleanor with outsiders, of watching her be scrutinized and judged by the sharp-eyed matrons of society, made something dark and possessive coil in his chest. Since the storm, Eleanor had been distant, polite but remote, treating him with the careful courtesy one might show a respected stranger. She still appeared at breakfast, still worked in the gardens, still dined with him each evening. But the warmth that had been building between them had vanished, replaced by a chill more devastating than any storm. He had tried to apologize, to explain, but she deflected every attempt with perfect, maddening grace. "There's nothing to apologize for, Your Grace," she said whenever he broached the subject. "You were quite clear about the nature of our arrangement. Your Grace." She had gone back to calling him that, and each time the title fell from her lips, it felt like a small death. Alexander knew he had no one to blame but himself. He had been offered a moment of truth, a chance to bridge the distance between them, and he had chosen fear instead. Now he was paying the price in Eleanor's cool withdrawal. The day of Lady Hartley's visit arrived too quickly. Eleanor appeared in the drawing room wearing one of her simple day dresses, well-made but unfashionable, at least 2 seasons out of date. She had refused the extensive wardrobe he had ordered for her, claiming she had no need of such finery. "You look lovely," Alexander said, because it was true. Eleanor's quiet elegance needed no enhancement. "Thank you, Your Grace." Her tone was pleasant but empty, and she didn't meet his eyes. He wanted to cross the room, take her hands, beg her to stop punishing him for his cowardice. But the sound of carriages on the gravel drive forestalled any such impulse. Lady Hartley swept in with her entourage, 3 other ladies and 2 gentlemen, all dressed in the height of London fashion. But it was the woman who entered last who made Alexander's stomach drop. Lady Catherine Winters. Beautiful, sophisticated, widowed, and, according to society gossip, hunting for her next husband. "Your Grace." Catherine glided toward him with practiced elegance, her crimson gown cut to showcase her considerable assets. "How wonderful to see you again. It's been far too long since you've graced London with your presence." They had been lovers once, briefly, before the war, a casual arrangement that had meant nothing to him, and, he suspected, even less to her. But the way she looked at him now suggested she might be interested in rekindling their association. "Lady Winters," he said coolly, stepping back to gesture toward Eleanor. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Ashworth. Eleanor, this is Lady Catherine Winters." Catherine's assessing gaze swept over Eleanor, taking in the simple dress, the unfashionable hair, the complete lack of jewelry. Her smile sharpened. "Your Grace." What a surprise. We had heard the Duke married suddenly, but the details were rather vague. "I'm married for love," Alexander heard himself say, the lie smooth and automatic. Everything else seemed irrelevant. Eleanor's eyes flew to his face, shocked, but he couldn't read what she was thinking. "How romantic," Catherine purred, though her tone suggested she found the concept laughable. "You must tell us the story. I'm sure it's quite fascinating." The tea service that followed was excruciating. Lady Hartley monopolized the conversation with society gossip, while the other ladies examined every detail of the drawing room with barely concealed curiosity. Catherine positioned herself next to Alexander, making it clear through subtle touches and meaningful glances that she considered Eleanor no obstacle to her pursuit. Alexander watched Eleanor navigate the social battlefield with quiet dignity. She poured tea with steady hands, answered invasive questions with gracious deflection, and refused to be rattled by Catherine's barbed comments about fashion and society. "You must find country life dreadfully dull after London, Your Grace," Catherine said, her voice dripping false sympathy. All those balls and soirees you're missing. The theater, the opera. Why, just last week Lord Pemberton threw the most magnificent party. I've never been to London, Eleanor said simply, so I cannot miss what I've never known. But I find the country far from dull. There's something deeply satisfying about working with living things, watching them grow and flourish with proper care. Working. Catherine's laugh was musical and cutting. My dear, you sound like a farmer's wife, not a duchess. Is there so great a difference? Eleanor met Catherine's gaze steadily. Both require dedication to something larger than oneself. Both involve nurturing and protecting what one is responsible for. I find the comparison rather apartment. Alexander felt a surge of pride, so intense it nearly choked him. Eleanor faced down Catherine's condescension without flinching, without pretending to be something she wasn't. She had more genuine nobility in her smallest finger than Catherine possessed in her entire being. How quaint, Catherine said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She turned to Alexander. You must bring her Grace to London for the season, your Grace. Show her what she's been missing. I'd be happy to introduce her to the right people, help her navigate society. The implication was clear. Eleanor was a country nobody who needed Catherine's guidance to become a proper duchess. That won't be necessary, Alexander said, his voice cold. My wife needs no instruction on how to comport herself. Catherine's eyes gleamed with interest at his sharp tone. She had always enjoyed a challenge. The visit dragged on interminably. When the guests finally departed, Eleanor excused herself immediately, claiming a headache. Alexander watched her flee up the stairs and had to restrain himself from following. But Catherine had other ideas. She had lingered behind, claiming to need a private word. I'm glad we have a moment alone, she said, moving closer. I wanted to tell you how sorry I was to hear about Captain Ashby. I know you were close. Thank you. This marriage, she continued, her hand coming to rest on his arm. It was very noble of you, Alexander, taking in his poor sister, giving her a home. But surely you don't intend to limit yourself to domestic obligations. A man has needs that cannot be met by gratitude and duty. Alexander removed her hand from his arm. I'm married, Catherine. To a woman you wed out of pity. Don't pretend otherwise. Everyone knows the circumstances. But marriage need not mean deprivation. She smiled, slow and seductive. We were good together once. We could be again. Discreetly, of course. The proposition should have meant nothing. Society marriages often included such arrangements. Lords with mistresses, ladies with lovers, all conducted with appropriate discretion. He could accept Catherine's offer, find physical release without emotional entanglement, and maintain his careful distance from Eleanor. But the very thought made him feel sick. No, he said firmly. I have no interest in discretion or in you. I suggest you look elsewhere for your entertainment. Catherine's expression hardened. Because of her? That plain little nobody you married? Alexander, be reasonable. She's not. She's my wife, he interrupted, steel in his voice. And you will speak of her with respect or not at all. Now, if you'll excuse me, Lady Winters, I believe your carriage is waiting. He left her standing in the drawing room and took the stairs 2 at a time, driven by a need to find Eleanor, to explain, to what? Confess that he had rejected another woman's advances because he was consumed by thoughts of his own wife? That he would rather spend one evening talking with Eleanor than 1,000 nights with anyone else? He found her in the conservatory, surrounded by the orchids she had been nursing back to health. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders rigid with tension. Eleanor, you should have accepted her offer, Eleanor said without turning. Her voice was eerily calm. Lady Winters, I mean. She's very beautiful, sophisticated, everything a duchess should be, and I am not. I don't want Catherine. Why not? She's clearly interested. And, as she so helpfully pointed out, our marriage is merely convenient. Why shouldn't you seek companionship elsewhere? Because I don't want companionship elsewhere. The words burst from him, too loud in the glass-enclosed space. Eleanor, please look at me. She turned slowly, and the pain in her eyes gutted him. I watched you today, she said quietly. Watched you with her. She's the kind of woman you should have married. The kind who belongs in your world. Not someone who doesn't know the first thing about London society, who wears outdated dresses and would rather garden than attend balls. You think I want someone like Catherine? Alexander moved toward her, unable to stop himself. You think I want false sophistication and empty charm? Eleanor, you're worth 1,000 Catherines. You have more genuine grace in your smallest gesture than she possesses in her entire being. Then why? Eleanor's voice broke. Why won't you? Why can't you? She stopped, pressing her hands to her face, and Alexander saw her shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. He couldn't bear it, couldn't watch her hurt because of him, because of his cowardice, his fear. All the walls he had built around his heart crumbled in the face of her pain. Because I'm terrified, he said hoarsely, closing the distance between them. Because what I feel for you is so far beyond anything I've ever experienced that it terrifies me. Because if I tell you the truth and you reject me, I don't know how I'll survive it. Eleanor lowered her hands, staring at him with wide eyes. What truth? This was it. The moment of absolute vulnerability he had been avoiding. Alexander could retreat again, could choose safety over honesty. But watching Eleanor's tears, seeing the hurt he had caused, he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. That I love you, he said, the words scraping his throat raw. That somewhere between duty and partnership, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you. That you become the center of my world, and the thought of you not loving me back is unbearable. That I am utterly, hopelessly obsessed with you, Eleanor, and I don't know what to do about it. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language. Her lips parted in shock. You love me, she whispered finally. With everything I am. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling, truly smiling. That transformation he had spoken of that made his heart stop. You impossible, infuriating man. Do you have any idea how long She broke off, laughing through her tears. I've loved you for weeks. Fell for you despite every attempt not to. Watched you watching me, and thought I was going mad with wanting you. The world tilted. You love me. Yes, you fool. Why else would I be so hurt by your distance? Why else would seeing you with Lady Winters feel like knives in my heart? They stared at each other across the orchids, both shocked, both hopeful, both terrified and exhilarated at once. We're rather ridiculous, aren't we? Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. Both in love, and both too frightened to say so. Completely ridiculous. May I? He reached for her, hesitant despite everything. May I kiss you? Please, Eleanor. I've been dreaming of it for so long. Yes, she breathed. Yes. He pulled her into his arms, and their lips met in a kiss that was everything he had imagined and more, tender and desperate, tentative and claiming, an apology and a promise all at once. Eleanor melted against him, her arms winding around his neck, and Alexander felt years of loneliness and grief and fear burn away in the heat of her response. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. I love you, he said again, needing to hear it aloud. My Eleanor, my wife, my everything. And I love you, she whispered back. My impossible Duke, my unexpected joy. They stood together in the conservatory as evening fell around them, holding each other as though they might never let go. The obsession had become love, and love, Alexander discovered, was far more powerful than any fear. The days following their confession in the conservatory passed in a haze of discovery and wonder. Alexander could not stop touching Eleanor. Not inappropriately. They were still learning each other, still navigating the transformation from distant spouses to acknowledged lovers. But he found constant excuses for contact. His hand at the small of her back as they walked through the gardens, fingers intertwined beneath the dinner table, stealing kisses in empty corridors like lovesick children. Eleanor bloomed under his attention. The careful reserve she had maintained melted away, revealing the passionate, joyful woman beneath. She laughed freely now, teased him about his obsessive cataloging of her habits, and returned his affections with an eagerness that made his blood sing. I love you, he told her a dozen times a day, making up for the weeks of silence. I know, she would respond with that luminous smile. You've mentioned it. But their happiness existed in a fragile bubble, and Alexander knew it could not last undisturbed. The first crack came in the form of another visit from Lady Hartley's party. Alexander tried to refuse, but Eleanor insisted. "We cannot hide forever," she said reasonably. "I am the Duchess of Ashworth. I have social obligations, whether I like them or not. And besides," her eyes sparkled with mischief, "I rather enjoy watching you scowl at Lady Winters." "I do not scowl. You absolutely do. It's quite fierce and rather attractive." He kissed her for that, unable to resist. But when the guests arrived 2 days later, Alexander's amusement faded quickly. Catherine had brought reinforcements, including Lord Pemberton, a handsome widower of 40 with a reputation as a charming conversationalist and an eye for beautiful women. Pemberton made directly for Eleanor. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over her hand with practiced grace. "I've been longing to meet you properly. Lady Hartley speaks so highly of your work with the estate." "You're too kind, Lord Pemberton," Eleanor replied with her usual graciousness. "Not at all. I'm something of an agricultural enthusiast myself. I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts on estate management. Perhaps you could show me these famous gardens I've been hearing about." Alexander's jaw clenched. The request was innocent enough. Eleanor had been showing various visitors through her restored gardens. But something in Pemberton's manner, the way his eyes lingered on Eleanor's face, set Alexander's teeth on edge. "I'm sure my wife is too busy," he began. "Not at all," Eleanor interrupted, shooting him a quelling look. "I'd be happy to show Lord Pemberton the gardens. If you'll excuse us." Alexander watched them leave together, Pemberton's head bent attentively toward Eleanor as she spoke, and felt something dark and possessive coil in his chest. "Jealous, Your Grace?" Catherine's voice was honey-sweet poison at his elbow. "How unexpected. I thought you were above such petty emotions." "I'm not jealous," Alexander said through gritted teeth. "Of course not. Though I must say, Pemberton does have a way with ladies, particularly lonely ones who might feel neglected by their husbands." Alexander's hands fisted at his sides. "Eleanor is not neglected, isn't she? You barely touched her at dinner last week. Barely looked at her. Some might think the bloom had already faded from your marriage of convenience." She was baiting him, and he knew it. But the barb struck home nonetheless. He and Eleanor had been so careful in public, maintaining propriety even as they explored their new intimacy in private. Had he been too careful? Did Eleanor feel neglected despite his constant private attentions? He looked through the window toward the gardens, where Eleanor and Pemberton walked among the roses. Pemberton was laughing at something she had said, and Eleanor, God help him, was smiling back, animated and lovely in the afternoon sun. "Excuse me," Alexander said abruptly, striding toward the French doors. He found them in the rose garden, standing close together as Eleanor explained some detail of pruning technique. Pemberton's attention seemed genuinely focused on the roses, but his proximity to Eleanor made Alexander see red. "Fascinating," Pemberton was saying. "You clearly have a gift for this, Your Grace. My own gardens are rather neglected. Perhaps you might visit sometime and offer advice? I'd be most grateful for your expertise." "Lord Pemberton," Alexander said, his voice colder than he intended. "I believe the others are waiting for us inside. Ashworth." Pemberton turned with a smile. "Your wife is a marvel. The transformation she's achieved here is remarkable. You're a lucky man." "I'm aware." Something in Alexander's tone made Pemberton's smile falter. "Quite. Well, Your Grace," he turned back to Eleanor. "Thank you for the tour. It was most enlightening." When Pemberton left, Eleanor rounded on Alexander. "That was incredibly rude. He was flirting with you. He was discussing roses." While standing far too close and looking at you like, Alexander stopped himself, hearing how irrational he sounded. Eleanor's expression shifted from annoyance to something else. Something that might have been understanding. "Alexander, are you jealous?" "Yes," he bit out. "Yes, I'm jealous. Of every man who looks at you, speaks to you, makes you smile. I know it's unreasonable and possessive and rather wonderful." Eleanor interrupted softly. She stepped closer, placing her hands on his chest. "You do realize that Lord Pemberton could recite poetry and shower me with attention, and I wouldn't feel a fraction of what I feel when you simply enter a room. You're certain?" He hated the vulnerability in his voice. Completely. She rose on her toes, brushing her lips against his. I love you, Alexander Thorne. Only you. Always you. The tension drained from his shoulders. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. I'm sorry. I know I'm being ridiculous. You're being human. And rather sweet, actually. They stood together in the dappled shade of a rose arbor, holding each other while the afternoon sun warmed them. Alexander had never felt more content, more at peace. The feeling lasted exactly 20 minutes. They returned to the house to find the drawing room in an uproar. Catherine stood at the center of it, holding court with the other guests, her voice carrying clearly. Simply cannot understand why the Duke would bind himself so permanently to someone so unsuitable. Yes, the captain's death was tragic, but surely there were other ways to honor his memory than marrying his dowdy sister out of pity. Eleanor froze beside Alexander. Her hand in his went rigid. Catherine saved the Duke from himself, really, one of the other ladies tittered. Can you imagine being trapped in a loveless marriage to a woman who cannot even dress herself properly? No wonder he looks so miserable. I heard, Catherine continued, clearly enjoying her audience, that the poor dear didn't even have a proper trousseau. Had to wear the same 6 dresses in rotation because the Duke was too embarrassed to spend money on her appearance. As if anyone could make her fashionable. Red fury descended over Alexander's vision. He felt Eleanor try to pull away, felt her shame and hurt radiating through their joined hands, and something inside him snapped. How dare you, he said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward where he stood with Eleanor in the doorway. Your Grace, Catherine began, false innocence dripping from her words. I didn't realize you were. How dare you speak of my wife with such disrespect, Alexander continued, his voice deadly quiet. How dare you come into my home and insult the woman I love? Catherine's eyes widened. Love? But surely. You know nothing about my marriage, Alexander said, moving into the room with Eleanor at his side. He felt her trembling, but whether from anger or hurt, he couldn't tell. Nothing about what Eleanor and I share. You presume to judge her based on her wardrobe and her country manners, as though those superficial things matter. He turned to address the entire room, his voice ringing with conviction. My wife is worth more than every person in this room combined. She has more intelligence, more compassion, more genuine grace than any society beauty I've ever met. She transformed a dying estate through her own work and dedication. She saved lives during a fire, while ladies like you would have fainted at the sight of smoke. She has the loyalty of every servant in this house, because she treats them like human beings rather than furniture. Eleanor made a small sound beside him, but he wasn't finished. Yes, I married her to honor a dying friend's request, but I fell in love with her because she is remarkable, because she sees the world with clear eyes and a generous heart, because she makes me want to be better than I am, because every moment with her is a gift I never expected to receive. He turned to Eleanor then, taking both her hands in his, speaking to her alone though the room still watched. I'm sorry, he said hoarsely. Sorry that I ever made you feel less than cherished. Sorry that I hid my feelings like a coward while you faced judgment alone. Sorry that I didn't tell you from the beginning that you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but she was smiling. Alexander, I love you, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Desperately, completely, irrevocably. You are not convenient. You are not an obligation. You are my wife, my partner, my heart. And anyone who cannot see your worth is blind. The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander became aware that he had just made the most public declaration of his life, had exposed his heart to a room full of society gossips who would spread this story across England. He found he didn't care. I think, Eleanor said softly, her voice steady despite her tears, that perhaps it's time for our guest to leave. An excellent suggestion. Alexander turned to the stunned room. Lady Hartley, ladies, gentlemen, I believe this visit has concluded. Hayes will show you out. Catherine looked as though she had been slapped. Your Grace, surely you don't mean. I mean exactly what I said. You insulted my wife. You are no longer welcome in this house. He gestured to the door. All of you, leave. There was a flurry of movement, shocked whispers, rustling skirts, fumbled farewells. Lord Pemberton paused at the door. "My apologies, Ashworth," he said quietly. "I meant no offense earlier. Your wife is indeed remarkable. You're a fortunate man." "I know," Alexander replied, his arm around Eleanor's waist. When the last guest had departed and the sound of carriages faded, Alexander and Eleanor stood alone in the drawing room. She turned to him, eyes still wet with tears. "You just publicly humiliated Lady Winters and half the county's aristocracy," she said. "Yes. We'll probably never be invited anywhere again." "I sincerely hope not." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy. "You're mad. Completely mad. Mad for you." He cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "I meant every word, Eleanor. You are everything to me." "I know," she whispered. "I've always known, even when I was afraid to believe it. But Alexander, you didn't have to defend me like that. I can bear society's judgment. But you shouldn't have to. Not alone. Not ever." He pressed his forehead to hers. "We're partners, remember? In everything. That includes facing down cruel gossips who don't deserve to breathe the same air as you. What will we do now? We've made ourselves pariahs. We'll live here in our beautiful home and be happy. We'll manage the estate together. We'll restore the gardens. We'll build a life that has nothing to do with society's approval and everything to do with what we choose." He pulled back to look at her properly. "Unless you want the London season, balls and parties, and—" "God, no." Eleanor shuddered. "I want exactly what you described. A life here with you. The gardens and the library and our work together. I want mornings in the rose garden and evenings by the fire. I want to argue with you about crop rotation and kiss you in empty corridors. Then that's what we'll have." He kissed her softly, tenderly. "Though I should warn you after that display, everyone will know I'm obsessed with my wife." "Good," Eleanor said against his lips. "Let them know. I'm rather obsessed with my husband too." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, with the promise of more to come. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Alexander saw his entire future in Eleanor's eyes. "Come to bed with me," he whispered. "Please, Eleanor. I can't wait any longer. I need—" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice fierce with wanting. "Yes, Alexander. Take me to bed. Make me yours in truth." Hand in hand, they fled up the stairs toward his chambers, leaving propriety and caution far behind. The breaking point had arrived, and on the other side of it lay surrender. Alexander's chambers were bathed in the golden light of late afternoon when they entered. Eleanor had never been here before. This was his private sanctuary, and the intimacy of being invited inside made her heart race. She stood in the center of the room, suddenly uncertain. They had confessed their love, had shared passionate kisses in the conservatory and gardens. But this was different. This was crossing the final threshold for marriage in name to marriage in truth. "Eleanor," Alexander said softly, closing the door behind them. "Are you certain? We don't have to, if you need more time." "I'm certain." She turned to face him, seeing her own nervousness reflected in his eyes. "I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Alexander. I want this. I want you." He crossed to her slowly, as though afraid sudden movement might break the spell. When he reached her, he took her hands in his, raising them to his lips and kissing each palm with reverent tenderness. "I've imagined this," he confessed, his voice rough. "Dreamed of it more times than I can count. But now that the moment is here, I find I'm terrified of disappointing you." Eleanor's heart melted. This powerful duke, this man who had faced battle and death, was vulnerable before her. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the slight rasp of stubble against her palms. "You could never disappoint me," she whispered. "I love you exactly as you are." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Eleanor felt her nervousness dissolve in the heat of his passion. His hands moved to her hair, pulling pins free until the dark mass tumbled down her back. He tangled his fingers in it, groaning against her mouth. "So beautiful," he murmured between kisses. "I've wanted to see you like this. Wanted to touch you like this. Then touch me," Eleanor breathed. "Please, Alexander. I need." She didn't have words for what she needed, but he seemed to understand. His hands moved to the buttons of her dress, fingers working with surprising dexterity despite their trembling. Eleanor helped him, and soon the fabric pooled at her feet, leaving her in her chemise and stockings. Alexander stepped back, his gaze raking over her with such hunger that Eleanor felt heat bloom across her skin. Self-consciousness flickered. She was not voluptuous like Lady Winters, not curved and lush. But the look in Alexander's eyes banished every doubt. "Perfect," he said hoarsely. "You're perfect, Eleanor." She reached for his cravat, her own fingers fumbling with the knot. "Your turn. It's hardly fair that you're still fully dressed." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his serious face, and helped her remove his coat, his waistcoat, his shirt. When his chest was bare, Eleanor placed her hands on his skin, feeling the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. Scars marked his torso, evidence of battles fought, wounds survived. She traced one with gentle fingers, a puckered mark near his ribs. "Portugal," he said quietly. "A bayonet. Thomas saved my life that day too, pulled me out of the melee before the French could finish what they'd started." Eleanor pressed her lips to the scar, a kiss of gratitude for the friend who had saved this man she loved. Alexander's breath caught, and his hands tightened on her shoulders. "Eleanor, make love to me," she said, looking up at him. "I don't want to wait any longer. I want to be yours completely." He lifted her in his arms. She made a small sound of surprise, and carried her to the bed. The mattress was soft beneath her as he laid her down, following her onto the silk coverlet. His weight was welcome, his warmth surrounding her as he kissed her again. What followed was a revelation. Eleanor had known, in theory, what happened between husband and wife. But knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. Alexander touched her with reverent care, his hands learning every curve, every sensitive place that made her gasp and arch beneath him. He whispered words of love against her skin, told her she was beautiful, cherished, adored. When he finally joined them together, there was pain, brief and sharp. But Eleanor focused on his face above her, on the love and wonder in his eyes, on the feeling of connection, so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "My Eleanor."